Hi there, and welcome to video 17. For this video, there are 4 learning intentions. The first learning intention is to describe the territorial and social organization of a seigneurie, and the success criteria is that I can describe the territorial and social organization of a seigneurie. The second learning intention is to explain the daily life of the peasantry, and the success criteria is that I can explain the daily life of a peasant on a seigneurie. The third learning intention is to explain the adaptations of the peasantry to the conditions in New France, and the success criteria is that I can explain using examples the adaptation of the peasantry to conditions in New France. And finally, the last learning intention is to describe the significance of slavery on the society of New France. And the success criteria is that you can describe the significance of slavery on the society in New France. The seigneurial system was both a method of land division and a system of social relationships. Land was granted by the king to the seigneur, who might be a nobleman or a religious order, like the Jesuits, the Ursulines, or the Sulpicians, who were the seigneurs of the island of Montreal. Seigneurs did not actually own the land. That still was reserved for the king, but rather they had rights to the productive activities on the territory. So, for example, the habitants, or the peasants, would have to pay the cens, which was a form of rent. They also paid the rent, which was paid either in cash or in agricultural product in kind. They had to pay banalités, which were taxes on grain used at the seigneur's mill, and also they had to provide corvée, which was unpaid labor to the seigneur. So the social relationships that developed were one of lord and peasants. However, this wasn't like the feudal system. The lord didn't own them. The peasants or the habitants were not serfs. Rather, they had a certain degree of independence. And the seigneur also had to reaffirm his loyalty to the king. There were certain advantages to the way that the seigneurial system was set up. The long, thin strips of land near the water that characterizes it. So the first was that because the houses were so close together, it minimized the amount of roads that had to be built. As well, each habitant had access to the water, which benefited them because the river system was the main form of transportation. As well, they had access to drinking water, and they could also fish. For the settlers on a seigneurie, daily life was one full of hard work. At first, settlers had to clear their own land. A typical summer's work might result in 1 or 2 arpents, which was a unit of land measurement, roughly equivalent to an acre. And they had first planted the crops of the Iroquois, corns, bean, and squash. But later, as their farms grew, they switched to wheat as their main crop. Most farms would have also have had a few cows and pigs, a dozen chickens, and a vegetable garden for growing vegetables. Also, farms grew to be usually between 60 and 120 arpents. Settlers also had horses, and they loved to drive their calèches in the summer and their carrioles in the winter. While many of the settlers still imported some luxury goods, like wine, for example, the habitants adapted to their new land and society. Tobacco was also grown in the back gardens and was, of course, smoked. The habitants used adaptations from the Aboriginal people, like snowshoes in the wintertime, and they adapted their houses to the climate conditions. So, for example, the roofs on their houses were peaked in such a way that snow could not build on the top and cave in, that snow could fall off. Gardens faced south, so they got the maximum amount of sun. And windows typically did not face the northwest, which is the direction that the wind blew predominantly. So men also in the wintertime tended to work in the fur trade, particularly the men that lived in the Montreal or Trois-Rivières areas. The Society of New France was also a society that practiced slavery. However, slavery in the St. Lawrence Valley differed from slavery in the Louisiana part of New France. In the St. Lawrence Valley, under an ordinance of 1709, slavery was officially granted legal status, which meant that slaves had no legal status. Most slavery in the St. Lawrence Valley consisted of black slaves who worked as domestics. These slaves were either traded from the 13 colonies or arrived with colonial officials as they came from the Caribbean. No slave ship is recorded to have entered the St. Lawrence Valley. There were also Aboriginal slaves. These were known as panis, and they were sold into New France from Aboriginal allies of the French in the Illinois Valley, far to the west. However, in Louisiana, slavery was practiced on a much larger scale, both with Aboriginal slaves and also black slaves. Those slaves there typically worked in fields, and the system of slavery was much closer to that of the southern 13 colonies. Well, thanks for watching. As you finish up your summary, please consider the following essential question. What is required for a society to function?